Hello and welcome to Radio Westeros. I'm Yolkboy and it's great to be here to talk about the 10th and final episode of the season for House of the Dragon called The Black Queen. Today we'll be reacting to and evaluating this episode as well as making plenty of book comparisons because we are fans of the book and it's quite a book-centric episode. We will avoid spoiling the future plot of House of the Dragon, but we do have a spoiler section at the end, and I'll give you a giant heads up for that. So whatever your Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones background, I think we have a lot to offer tonight. In this episode, there was no significant time jump. Rhaenys has left the mainland of Westeros and is on her way to Dragonstone. Last week, the episode focused on the Green faction and their reaction to Viserys' death, where they crowned Aegon in front of the crowds of King's Landing. Here, we saw the Black faction react to that news, and Rhaenyra considers her response to what she views as a good old usurping. Showrunner Ryan Condal called this the sister episode to the last one, and the only Greens we see are Otto and Aemond. Given this was the season finale, the writers wanted to go out with a bang, and towards the end of the episode was a really wonderfully sequenced dragon chase scene that kicked off the conflict of the Dance of the Dragons in style. It's been a great season, I think, and a lot of us feel that the show has exceeded our expectations. So we can't wait to get into talking about this finale. So without further ado, let me introduce my Radio Westeros co-host, Lady Gwyn.
Hello, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Nice to see you here. Welcome yet again this is week 11, the finale, and we're so happy. We have so much to talk about. This was, like Yolkboy said, very book-centric, lots of quotes, even where we diverge from Fire and Blood a little bit, we're pulling quotes. So we have a lot to go through tonight. And as always, we're welcoming our season co-host, Emily, with us.
Hi, I can't believe we're at the end almost.
Here we are at the end of all things, or maybe not really the end of all things, but
end of all season one
end
things.
Of all of this, sort of, yeah. Well, we have, like I said, loads to say tonight. But before we get started, as usual, we want to tell you that Radio Westeros is supported by our patrons, and you can find out more about our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/Radio Westeros. And we begin, as always, with a quick shout out for our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patron, Peter, and our Palest Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Daniel, Crispy, the Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Laura, Sister Winter, Moltude, John Wagarian, and MT Walls, first of his name, as well as B Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jag Hot Dog Shop. House motto: we forge the chains we wear in life. And as a reminder, we'll do shout outs later on for anyone who uses the super chat option tonight, and thank you in advance for that. And we also want to let you all know that next week at this time, we will be hosting our season wrap-up, which will include the three of us plus special guests. And we will be in live stream format only for that because we anticipate having a good group of people. So it's going to be pretty laid back, talking about the entire season. And it will also be a fundraiser for a special cause, and that cause is Dream Foundry's Con or Bust program. Con or Bust is dedicated to increasing diversity in speculative fiction by making direct cash grants to fans and creators of color to help defray the costs of attending industry events and conventions. And we think that is a great cause. And this fundraiser will be live during the live stream, and we'll also be providing links in our socials and on YouTube for anyone who's interested in learning more about the program or donating before or after the fact. We do appreciate everyone who's been with us for the past 11 weeks and hope that you come by for one more after this one.
And one more quick update from Radio Westeros HQ. If you love dragons and now the show's done, you're craving for more dragon action, we're really pleased to tell you we have a new regular episode all about dragons in A Song of Ice and Fire, from their origins to their impact on the story, including a huge look at every dragon in the text, all your favorites, all the shapes and sizes and colors. We don't think you're going to be disappointed with this one. It's currently on the Patreon rollout and will be released for the public after that. So stay tuned. Okay, so why don't we begin with our analysis tonight and talk about something a lot of the fandom is discussing at the moment, the wonderful painted table. Why don't you take us away, Lady Gwyn?
This was one of my favorite parts of the entire episode, and I had a lot of favorite parts. The episode opened with a long shot of the famed painted table at Dragonstone. Located at the top of the stone drum, which is the central keep of Dragonstone, it is justly famous as the war room from which Aegon planned his conquest, and it features heavily in this episode. So we thought we'd start with a brief history and description of it from the main series. There is no better source for that than Maester Crescent's prologue from A Clash of Kings, which is set on Dragonstone. And so, from Crescent's thoughts, we have this about the table. It is in a great round room with walls of bare black stone and 4 tall, narrow windows that look out onto the 4 points of the compass. In the center of the chamber was the great table from which it took its name, a massive slab of carved wood fashioned at the command of Aegon Targaryen in the days before the conquest. The painted table was more than 50 feet long, perhaps half that wide at its widest point, but less than 4 feet across at its narrowest. Aegon's carpenters had shaped it after the land of Westeros, sawing out each bay and peninsula until the table nowhere ran straight. On its surface, darkened by 300 years of varnish, were painted the 7 kingdoms as they had been in Aegon's day: rivers and mountains, castles and cities, lakes and forests. There was a single chair in the room, carefully positioned in the precise place that Dragonstone occupied off the west coast of Westeros, raised up to give a good view of the tabletop. So we get that first scene in episode 10. And in that scene, the difference between the book table and the show table are not completely obvious. We see a lot of the landmarks and principal holdings of Westeros marked out on it, and it's pretty impressive. But the wow factor, of course, comes a few seasons later when the table's shown backlit by massive trays of candles beneath it, which causes all the waterways and engravings to glow like rivers of lava. And I'm sure you'll all agree that even in an episode full of outstanding characters and superlative acting, the table really stood out as one of the stars of the show. So without further ado, why don't we move on to the very first scene as we open with Lucerys Velaryon standing where his most famous ancestor must have once stood, looking at the table.
Yeah, so Lucerys is looking at Driftmark's location on the table. When his mother enters the room, he says the sea snake is going to die, and he's really upset that would mean that he becomes the Lord of Tides. Remember, we saw him in episode 7 telling Corlys that he didn't want to inherit Driftmark because that would mean everyone had died. And now he does believe Corlys is at death's door. It's, of course, really sad to watch this scene knowing that Corlys actually lives, but it's Luke that's headed towards his end. He's seen Laenor die, and he watched as Damon kill Vaemond because he believed himself to have a better claim. He says he gets seasick in port, and altogether, I think Luke is really unsure of his place in the world. From his perspective, his sense of identity is neither here nor there. And when he returned to his old haunt in the Red Keep's training yards 2 episodes ago, he seemed really insecure about not looking like a Targaryen. Everyone's whispering under their breaths about him being illegitimate. The writers are portraying a young teenager who is wholly unsure of himself, because I think they're bringing him into contrast with Aemond, who is older, stronger, and extremely self-assured. So Rhaenyra is a loving mother and tries to reassure him and tell him that he is worthy, that his self-doubts are natural, and she had to contend with them herself once. Jace replies that he's not like her. He's not perfect. And it's clear how all the deaths and the continual remarks about his legitimacy have bored into his confidence. But the fact he still adores his mother does speak volumes. Rhaenyra does eventually get through to him by conceding that she herself is far from perfect. She smiles warmly at him and says, "My father looked after me and prepared me for my duties, and your mother will do the same to you." Mother and son seem content here. It is Game of Thrones. It lasts for a good few seconds before they're interrupted by ill tidings from the capital. Sir Laurent Marbrand of the Kingsguard interrupts with news of Rhaenys' arrival, and the viewer knows what that means.
Yes, Rhaenys has arrived on Dragonback, which indicates a need for haste, and requested an urgent audience with Damon and Rhaenyra. Like you just said, we, the audience, might guess what her message is going to be. But from the look exchanged by Rhaenyra and Luke, and then from Rhaenyra's words of greeting, I think it's pretty plain that they actually expected this visit was going to be news of Lord Corlys' death. Instead, her cousin delivers news of her father's death, and she does it quite abruptly and gets right to the point, which comes as a great shock to Rhaenyra, who had just left him mere days before with the intention of returning to his side. And relentlessly, Rhaenys tells her the rest. In spite of the show of reconciliation in the Red Keep, Alicent has betrayed her and crowned her son publicly in Rhaenyra's stead. There is no doubt in either Rhaenyra's or Daemon's minds that when they left the Red Keep, Viserys had just publicly reaffirmed his succession in her favor, and that Alicent had privately accepted it. And so, in addition to the shock of the loss of her father, Rhaenyra's once again navigating the shock of betrayal by her friend, which really is its own kind of loss. Damon, on the other hand, is full of rage. He's convinced that the Greens, Alicent in particular, have murdered his brother. In this, he basically echoes the accusation that got Lord Beesbury killed, but this is Daemon Targaryen, and in this case, his conviction is much more likely to get other people killed. So, hearing about Aegon's coronation and Rhaenys' presence in the Dragon Pit with Meleys, he wants to know, like many of us did last week, why she didn't simply roast them all. And here Rhaenys shows herself to be worthy of the destiny she was denied when she reminds Daemon that war may be coming. It's not her war to start, a statement that actually goes a long ways towards clarifying the long view of Rhaenys' decision to spare Alicent and her children. Like any good vassal or general, Rhaenys was actually adhering to a chain of command, basically, I think, unlike some of the decisions that we'll see shortly from the aptly named Rogue Prince. Rhaenys Targaryen was avoiding going rogue. So as she goes to leave, Rhaenyra, having shown some signs of discomfort throughout this scene, staggers and announces that her baby is coming. The timing is very bad in more ways than one. Notably, it is far too early for this birth, and so Rhaenyra is instantly seen to be in some sort of peril.
Yeah, absolutely. At a critical moment for Rhaenyra, as her allies, or excuse me, her enemies rally strength to their cause, she's essentially out of the game due to her position as a mother, or more specifically, a person giving birth. We saw a lot of focus on the race against the clock nature for the Greens in the last episode, who in 24 hours bolstered their position as much as possible and were pretty successful other than the obvious Meleys jailbreak situation. So Rhaenyra being sidelined by her labor at this critical point was hard to watch. Emma Darcy spoke in the Inside the Episode about how difficult this was for Rhaenyra, who spent her whole life resenting her role as a royal womb and at the same time preparing for another role as ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. To now be sidelined from the latter, which she considers her real and primary duty by her role as a woman and a mother, is really difficult. I really appreciated their nuanced take on Rhaenyra, and that interpretation added something to an otherwise pretty hard to watch sequence. At the center of what ends up being another tragedy in the birthing bed, we find Rhaenyra facing that crisis where her two identities, her two primary responsibilities, are completely at odds with one another as the clock ticks down. And in this moment, she also seems very alone. There's a maester there as well as midwives, but she's keeping a lot of physical distance from them as they fret about her early labor and try to coax her into allowing them to actually help. It's worth noting that this maester is likely Maester Gerardis, a long trusted advisor to Rhaenyra, who has served on Dragonstone as maester and likely also delivered her two sons by Damon. Gerardis is someone that Rhaenyra trusts a lot in Fire and Blood. She steals the other maester's chain and gives it to him. This is also likely why she actually has a maester in the room at this point, unlike her midwife-only delivery of Joffrey in episode 6. Notably, neither Rhaenys or Damon are present, though they both saw her labor begin in the prior scene. It seems that both her duty as a queen and duty as a mother are at times really lonely places for Rhaenyra. We do at least find out where Rhaenys goes, though. And Yolkboy is muted, but he's trying to tell you.
Yeah, Rhaenys heads down to the beach where Jace and Luke are practicing their swords, and she watches them from afar. Jace is aggressively overpowering Luke, which tells us that the brothers are very different and that the younger is more of a boy. He's unable to defend himself. More groundwork for what happens later. So Rhaenys interrupts, insisting that the lads go to their mother immediately. She knows Damon is beginning to go rogue, and this is her way of curtailing that possibility. She sends the brothers along because they're Rhaenyra's heirs and Damon isn't. So she wants them to understand their mother's wishes in case Rhaenyra is too incapacitated to make crucial decisions, or in the worst case scenario, that she dies from childbirth as her mother Emma did. We know Rhaenys didn't attack the Greens at the coronation in part because she has respect for the chain of command. And she knows that Damon, left to his own devices, will perhaps not respect that chain. You're muted.
Have we done this before? Is this our first one? So sent fresh from Rhaenys, Rhaenyra's eldest boys enter her apartments and they see her laboring. She tells them that King Viserys has passed, and Luke in particular is hit hard by this news. He's been fretting about his grandfather Corlys and what that loss will mean for him as heir of Driftmark, but instead is completely blindsided by the news that it's his other grandfather, Viserys. Despite Viserys being in failing health for years now, that was an almost constant in the boys' lives. So I think that in a way, they weren't expecting it nearly as much. Grandpa's always been sick. This is the moment, really. Rhaenyra does not pull punches here, telling them that next that Aegon has been crowned and stolen the throne. She strongly refutes the Green's claims and reminds Jace that he is her heir, which now puts him next in line to the Iron Throne, barring the pesky Aegon problem. She knows Damon will favor war and, as mentioned before, is afraid of things moving beyond her control as she's confined to the birthing bed. Much like Rhaenys, she knows that Damon's hatred of the Greens will overpower his desire to wait for her laboring to end, and she fears what actions he'll take in her name. Jace steps up in this moment, assuring her that he can handle Damon and that her wishes will be respected.
So in parallel with Rhaenyra's labor, Damon is holding a war council. Damon, true to his name, as Lady Gwyn said, is going rogue. Initially, his plans are good, related to defense, since, as he correctly assumes, the Greens would strike with stealth, if at all, at this point, patrolling the shoreline in the skies, pressing the Dragon Keepers into defensive service, seem like valid actions to take. Where he begins to exceed his remit is in sending messages to other lords. There's news that Lord Corlys has left Tarth, something that was mentioned as being imminent in episode 8. But recall, mere days have passed. during these past 3 episodes. So yeah, that's a bit jarring, wasn't it? Corlys's destination is now unknown. Lord Bartimos Seltagar is present, and they discuss sending messages to Lords Darklyn, Massey, and Bar Emmon, the Lords of the Narrow Sea, who will be amongst Rhaenyra's first supporters. He also swiftly identifies the Riverlands as the key to their support, Muppet City, and announces his plan to go there himself. It's at this moment Viserys comes in and asserts that nothing should be done while his mother is abed on her direct orders. Damon, perhaps understanding the need for urgent action, orders the Ravens sent nonetheless and takes Jace outside for a little life lesson.
Yes, he does. He takes Sir Stephen Darklyn and Sir Lorent Marbrand along as well. These are the 2 Kingsguard who happened to be on Dragonstone with Rhaenyra and her family when the news of Viserys' death arrived. As such, their loyalty, though apparently to Rhaenyra, is by no means guaranteed. Should either of these men decide that their vows to serve the crown and take orders from the king and their Lord Commander now mean that they should serve the Greens, they're standing in a very convenient place to do a lot of damage very quickly. And as evidence of exactly how the Greens planned to use the Kingsguard against Rhaenyra, we have only to look back at last week's Green Council when Sir Otto ordered Sir Harold Westerling to take his knights to Dragonstone and kill Rhaenyra and her family. So Damon is correct to be worried. He, of course, does a very Damon thing. He takes the 2 guards out to the Dragon Mount and asks them where their loyalties lie. The way his question is framed essentially mirrors the way Rhaenyra addressed Grand Maester Orwyle in Fire and Blood when he came as an emissary from the Greens, delivering terms from Aegon, which in this show is a task that will fall to Sir Otto Hightower, as we'll talk about later. But here's the passage that's relevant to this one. It says, Rhaenyra heard the terms in stony silence, then asked Orwyle if he remembered her father, King Viserys. Of course, your grace, the maester answered. Perhaps you can tell us who he named as his heir and successor, the queen said, her crown upon her head. You, your grace, Orwyle replied, and Rhaenyra nodded. And so, of course, Damon taking those questions over in the show, asks the questions, and then goes on to offer the 2 men a choice: either swear their oaths anew to Rhaenyra as queen, or accept a swift death from Caraxes, who appears on cue over the crest of the hill. Should they swear now and forswear themselves at some point in the future, Damon promises the men that they will die screaming. So this scene and the words are cut with the culmination of Rhaenyra's birth scene. And in fact, as Damon mentions, screaming with Caraxes very much grinning over his shoulder. Rhaenyra is screaming in the keep, and Syrax is screaming in her den. So you get these 3 different things happening at the same time. And that brings us to the stillbirth of Rhaenyra and Damon's 3rd child and only daughter. In Fire and Blood, she is given the name Visenya, but the show doesn't tell us the child's name. I think they also don't tell us that it was a baby girl. This scene is very different in the show, in fact, and besides the loss of the name and the sex, there are other things that are lost in the show version. First and foremost is that Visenya in Fire and Blood was one of those deformed so-called dragon babies that are occasionally born to Targaryens, which notably we first see in A Game of Thrones with Dany and Rhaego. But more importantly, giving birth to a dragon baby was also the cause of Laena Valerion's death in Fire and Blood. And as Yolkboy will suggest in a moment, there is evidence that the show may have intended to show this aspect of Visenya's birth, but ultimately decided against it. the idea that there was something inherently wrong with the unborn child, and paired with the fact that there was a recent history of a birth like this in Lena's tragic death, and that Rhaenyra sensed what the problem was and only wanted to get through and actually survive the experience, unlike her friend and cousin Lena. These are things that are communicated pretty clearly in Fire and Blood, but I feel like these themes are somewhat blunted in this episode. They did a very good job showing Rhaenyra's fear when she spoke with her sons, but in other ways, the scene is reduced to a horrific and highly inconvenient stillbirth. Overall, I just felt like it was a bit rushed and confusing. And even though we get to see scenes of the grieving parents afterwards, I'm pretty sure viewers not steeped in Fire and Blood missed not only the child's name and sex, but many of the implications of her stillbirth that were communicated pretty clearly in the source material.
Yeah, like Lady Gwen is saying, the idea that Visenya is a dragon baby is much more prominent in Fire and Blood. The book quote is, "When the babe at last came forth, she proved indeed a monster, a stillborn girl, twisted and malformed, with a hole in her chest where her heart should have been, and a stubby, scaled tail," or so Mushroom describes her. You'd have to spend a pretty long time looking at stills of the scene and the baby to confirm that there were some potential deformities. But honestly, I think this was a big miss. I think they really should have gone all in with the idea so that it was visually quite clear, or scrapped it entirely and saved us the trouble of such a graphic scene. I think the writers were very clearly latched on to one of Martin's themes of a woman's battlefield being the birthing bed. But considering how much traumatic birth we've already seen this season, it felt a bit gratuitous this time, considering it didn't really follow the dragon baby narrative in a clear manner. Following the birth, we see Damon watching from afar as Rhaenyra cradles the stillborn girl, but he departs without a word. The couple grieves separately, with Rhaenyra preparing Visenya's body herself, attended by maesters, septons, midwives. Damon instead takes a walk on the beach. Both mother and father are overwhelmed by their grief and loss, openly crying, but they cope with it in very different ways. For Damon, he seeks solitude and uses this loss to further stoke his hatred for the High Towers. It strengthens his resolve to seek vengeance against his enemies. Rhaenyra instead finds comfort in ritual and process. She no doubt saw her mother go through child loss many times before ultimately dying with Balon. And there's some sort of a rote familiarity to her emotions as she cries, looking for meaning in her loss. In the books, Rhaenyra is portrayed as much angrier as she was in the show, with her saying, "She was my only daughter and they killed her. They stole my crown and murdered my daughter, and they shall answer for it." The show appears to have completely dropped this characterization of Rhaenyra. Instead, she's shown contrasting her husband, who has, again, been consumed by his anger towards their foes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed hearing both of your opinions on this scene, because I felt the same way, so I'm glad it's not just me. But then we have the pyre scene. So following Rhaenyra's miscarriage, there's a funeral for Visenya. It takes us back to Viserys and his son Balon, which is fitting considering Rhaenyra is compared to Viserys today. Watching the pyre, Damon and Rhaenyra stand solemnly, but as you guys have touched on, there's no dialogue. It seemed like a miss. It seems rushed, and I wish there'd been some sort of speech. David J. Peterson revealed that he had translated some words into High Valyrian to be spoken at the pyre by Rhaenyra. So he gave 3 translations of lines that they were thinking of going to use. So the first one, Visenya, my only daughter, born an abomination. Maybe she is a warning from the gods. So yeah, this is a reference to what Emily was saying about the scales and the stubby tail. And as Lady Gwyn said, it wasn't really clear in the show what was going on there. The second line Peterson wrote is, "She is an augury, born on the day my father died and my mother's crown was stolen." So augury means like an omen. So Rhaenyra is viewing this miscarriage is an ill omen, which I think it would have been a powerful line. And the third one from Peterson is, I would have called her Visenya, but she was not meant to be. So instead, there was no speech. And as you guys said, it just felt like there was something missing. So I don't really want to go over what you guys have already said, but it certainly seemed like a missed opportunity. Anyway, Damon blames Alicent and Otto for it in the books. So, yeah, what do you think, Emily?
Yeah, I agree with you, Yoke. Matt Smith has shown a ton of talent for conveying a lot without dialogue throughout the season of House of the Dragon, but it did feel to me like they could have done a bit more here to kind of connect the dots, especially for casual viewers. With his character behaving so erratically this episode, a bit more insight into his thoughts would have been nice, but I also understand that he's not really like a explain my feelings kind of guy. However, there's not really a lot of time for that in the scene as written, because the funeral has this surprise guest, Sir Eric Cargill. Last seen sneaking Princess Rhaenys out of the Red Keep before they were separated by crowds of small folk, Sir Eric has made his way to Dragonstone. Without benefit of a dragon mount, he took a little longer to arrive than Rhaenys, but he brings a much needed morale boost to a pretty tragic funeral. The Queensguard serving Rhaenyra moved to block his path as he approaches, uncertain of his loyalty, given that, we're talking about Prince Aegon's former sworn shield of all the Kingsguard. That was his role. However, he unveils Viserys' crown and kneels to renew his oath to the queen, and thus his brothers stand down. Given that Sir Eric was so conflicted about his service to Aegon that he defected, it was nice to see him giving his oath freely to Rhaenyra and to be honored for it. It also serves as a contrast to Daemon's more aggressive demands for oaths from his brothers. Now, we don't have an official text for the King or Queensguard oath anywhere in A Song of Ice and Fire. The closest that we get to it is Lord Commander Barristan Selmy's quotes on the matter. He says, "The first duty of the Kingsguard was to defend the king from harm or threat. The White Knights were sworn to obey the king's commands as well, to keep his secrets, counsel him when counsel was requested, and keep silent when it was not, serve his pleasure and defend his name and honor." Barristan also says, "Sir Gerald Hightower himself heard my vows, to ward the king with all my strength, to give my blood for his." And it seems like they took these concepts and then combined them with some familiar passages from the Night's Watch vows. As both orders require that men give up all claims to family, love, and lands, it makes sense and lends a bit of familiarity here. All in all, this was a really moving scene and some nice payoff for all the emotional conflict that Sir Eric went through with Aegon and his twin brother last episode.
Yes, I agree. It was very moving. I've watched it numerous times, and every time it just makes me cry for some reason. It's just one of those things.
It's true. She does.
Yeah. On the other hand, there were other things that didn't make me cry. So who knows? Who knows? I loved this scene, though. It was beautifully done. In addition to being a great scene. So last week we mentioned that in Fire and Blood, Sir Eric was Rhaenyra's sworn shield, which Emily just said was changed for the show. He was Aegon's personal guard, which was probably done in order to establish that personal conflict between him and his brother. But as he was already on Dragonstone in the book, the task of swiping Viserys' crown and defecting from the Red Keep actually fell to Sir Steffan Darklyn, who, of course, is one of the ones already on Dragonstone here. Minor change for dramatic reasons leaves us with the same result. Rhaenyra ends up with 3 of the Kingsguard with her, while Aegon has 3 with him, which is a change from the book because he does have 4 in the book. But with Sir Harold Westerling still alive and kind of leaving us not knowing what's going on with him, his loyalties have yet to be revealed. So there is this 7th Kingsguard sort of floating out there in the world somewhere. When Eric offers up Viserys' crown, which was last seen being laid upon his corpse by Alicent in episode 9, like I said, it's just an incredibly moving scene, not just for me and a lot of viewers, but for the people in universe. It's very clear that Damon is kind of lost in memories looking at that crown. And just days before, we had that tremendous scene where he placed the crown on his brother's head in the throne room of the Red Keep. But it must come with other memories as well, a lifetime of them, in fact, considering this wasn't just Viserys's crown, but it was that of his predecessor and Damon's grandfather, Jaehaerys the Conciliator. And as we said last week, Aegon having the Conqueror's crown and sword is important, sure, but there's also something really symbolic about Rhaenyra having her father's crown, the crown of the Conciliator. Because as this episode plays out, we'll see her trying to live up to her father's name and by extension to Jaehaerys. Damon is clearly an expert in political theater because he takes this moment with Sir Eric kneeling and pledging himself to the queen and offering up the crown to take the crown and place it on his wife's head, kneeling himself in turn and naming her queen himself. As he does so, the assembled nobles and Castle Smallfolk all follow suit, with the notable exception of Rhaenys Targaryen, who is present sort of at the back of the crowd. She's clearly still observing Rhaenyra. Just as Damon's actions, which are so reminiscent of past moments with his brother, are sort of visible proof of his belief in his wife, Rhaenys standing is proof that she hasn't yet made up her mind. In spite of her rejection of Alicent and Aegon, she knows that the final decision for House Valerian has to be made by her husband, who as yet is unaware of the gravity of the situation on Dragonstone and in King's Landing. And all in all, this is a very compelling scene, quite different from Fire and Blood, where we hear that Visenya was immolated in the castle yard and the coronation was carefully planned by the Black Council and actually held some days afterwards after Sir Steffon Darklyn arrived with the crown. So in an inversion, we'll see that the next scene is the Black Council, which is a counterpart to the Green Council that we saw last week.
Yes, as we said, sister episodes. So leading into this council meeting, we see a brief scene of swords being placed on a table in an antechamber. These will be the weapons of those attending the council. It's a small but important detail, as it's forbidden for anyone but the Queen's guards to carry a weapon in her presence. We also get the first shots of the painted table alight. Yeah, that was great, wasn't it? And when Rhaenyra enters the chamber, Damon announces her, and she's greeted by her stepdaughter Rhaena, acting in the role of the Queen's cupbearer, a very prestigious role that Rhaenyra once served for her father. However, if you recall, in those early council scenes where Rhaenyra was present as cupbearer, she literally only stood quietly in the corner and she poured some wine, reduced to being a servant and largely ignored in spite of her status as the king's heir. Rhaenyra, however, has no intention of sidelining any of her children, including her stepdaughters, both of whom she invites to join her at the table. When Rhaenyra opens the council, she asks for an evaluation of their position. Damon describes their defences: the knights, crossbowmen, men-at-arms of Dragonstone's garrison, more than sufficient for the island's defense. But as he also says in Fire and Blood, as an instrument of conquest, however, our army leaves something to be desired.
Yes, and after he says that, Maester Gerardus indicates that they have received declarations of support from houses Celtigar. Lord Bartimos is standing over his shoulder and bows his head. Staunton, Massey, Darklyn, and Bar Emmon, which this is a reference to the letters that Damon had ordered to be sent earlier. Rhaenyra begins directing the placement of the icons of specific houses, beginning with Aaron. And when Gerardus mentions that he sent a letter to Riverrun, though, with Damon's approval, Rhaenyra pauses. So we know that her husband has overstepped here, and so does he. But she lets it go and then proves her intimate knowledge of the Lords of the Realm when she notes that Lord Grover will need to be persuaded, which essentially is echoing Damon's earlier plan of going to the Riverlands in person, which he reiterates to her now. And we do see another glance pass between them that surely indicates that she's displeased at him taking action, both while she was dead and sort of presuming to make plans without her input. While I completely see her point, Damon kind of does have the right of it. In theory, swift action is essential, and the tension between Rhaenyra's roles as queen and mother are evident here once again. She also proves her acumen with her focus on Winterfell, the Eyrie, and Storm's End. That split, plus the houses that are going to join her from the Riverlands, essentially mirrors the split at the Great Council of 101, where those houses supported Laenor Valerian's claim through his mother over Viserys' claim via a younger son. But I think is interesting because it also foreshadows Robert's rebellion. In other words, that particular combination, Winterfell, the Eyrie, Storm's End, and some of the Riverlands at least, seems to be the key to Targaryen survival, because we'll see 150 years later that exact alliance against House Targaryen is what shatters their dynasty once and for all. So for some reason, magic combination there. With House Valerian still sidelined in Lord Corlys' absence, a notable difference from the Black Council in Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra inquires about who their enemies are. The Lannisters, of course, are notable Green supporters, clearly in Otto Hightower's pocket. They control the West. They're not going to change their minds. And here, it's also mentioned that they have a large fleet, which is a difference from Fire and Blood as well. This is going to prove to be in contrast with the Reach, which doesn't unilaterally join the Green cause, and the Riverlands, which in Fire and Blood, Damon notes to be notoriously quarrelsome, and whose support is going to be a key to Rhaenyra's victory. So this is no different as he announces his plan to take Harrenhal in the Riverlands to give them a place to consolidate their power. Damon is really proving his mettle as a strategist, because so far he's been correct about most of these things. But this scene also contains another key difference between book and show. In Fire and Blood, it's Princess Rhaenys who declares that their dragons are the key and enumerates their strength in that regard versus the Green's relative weakness. Here, it's Lord Bartimos Celtigar who takes some of Rhaenys' Fire and Blood words about dragons, introducing them as their main source of power, while Damon takes the rest. He enumerates the Black dragons and the Greens, placing the power imbalance at, in total, 13-4, plus the many eggs he has in the hatcheries. And we will have more on those numbers and who he's talking about during Dragon Watch later on. In contrast, in Fire and Blood, Damon is extremely restrained and actually argues against using dragons. We'll have more on that shortly, but I found this difference very interesting because in making Damon far more hawkish than his Fire and Blood counterpart throughout this episode, the show's continuing to create tension between him and his wife that isn't described in the source material. They're truly leaning into the Rogue Prince characterization, as we've seen many times with major departures from Fire and Blood, tending to blacken an already pretty black reputation. But I don't think anyone, including the showrunners and writers, would deny that Damon's military expertise is going to be the key to Rhaenyra's cause, and that by and large, with the possible exception of his enthusiastic support of dragon warfare, his strategies in the show are pretty sound.
Okay, so we're halfway through the analysis, and I just want to make a quick announcement that anyone who would like to join us on Discord, we have a private Discord server, and anyone watching is welcome to join us. The link is in the YouTube description. Come on over, come and hang out with us. So there you go. We'll leave the Discord link up for a few hours after the show, so you don't need to rush and do it this minute, but there you go. Okay, so why don't we talk about Otto Hightower? This next scene plays out on the bridge that allows visitors onto Dragonstone. This was the setting of a critical showdown between Damon and Otto in episode 2, with Rhaenyra arriving on Arrax and facing down her uncle, simultaneously stealing Otto's thunder. With that in mind, it makes sense that this scene was paralleled here, with Damon first confronting the Hand and Rhaenyra arriving on Arrax, but this time essentially trapping him between her husband and the guard, dragon on the other. How'd you like that, Otto? But this scene required a significant change from the source material. In Fire and Blood, Otto doesn't go himself, probably a wise decision given Damon's burning hatred for him and his value as a hostage. So rather than Sir Otto, the embassy was led by Grand Maester Orwyle, Septon Eustace, and Sir Arrax Cargill, and Otto's son, Sir Gawain, as well as more septons and gold cloaks. Orwyle was still present for the scene in the show and is shown respectfully bowing his head to Rhaenyra, as are Sir Arrax and a number of the Hand's personal guards, who all seem pretty unsure of how to defend the Hand from a dragon at close range. Yeah, to be perfectly honest. So, yeah, a bad situation for Otto there. There's the expected exchange of names and competing titles, and Rhaenyra declares them all to be traitors to the realm, after which Otto gets right to business with Aegon's terms.
Yeah, the Green's terms are a near direct copy from Fire and Blood, which makes sense since Grand Maester Orwyle was a key player in presenting said terms and is also a primary source for Fire and Blood. The most surprising offer to me is the Green's willingness to confirm the Driftmark succession, something they were clearly plotting against in the recent past. This offer may have been aimed to neutralize the Valerian threat. Otto also offers to take on Princes Aegon and Viserys, Rhaenyra's sons by Damon, as a cupbearer and a squire. But it's well documented in A Song of Ice and Fire. These types of honors are no more than a hostage situation, much like Theon viewed his time at Winterfell, or even Jon taking on wildling youths to ensure their parents' good behavior when they crossed south of the Wall. Children were often used as a mechanism for keeping their parents in line. When Jaime Lannister treats with Jonas Bracken, Jonas tells Jaime that he should take Lord Blackwood's 7-year-old daughter rather than one of his sons as a hostage, suggesting that this would be a more effective due to the Lord's love for his daughter. Unfortunately for Otto, Damon is far too clever to miss the subtext in these terms and makes that plain. Damon says he'd rather feed his sons to a dragon than let them become slaves to someone as drunken and unworthy as Aegon. Throughout this episode, and the relatively minimal dialogue that Damon has, he seems to be really broadcasting his feelings pretty plainly. He's not a heroic figure and likely really would rather destroy his own family than bend to the will of the Hightowers or betray what he believes House Targaryen is. It's an extreme position and not a particularly honorable one as a father, but it's true to the mercurial dragon-like anti-hero figure that Damon is. When Otto speaks his reply, it also basically comes right from the pages of Fire and Blood. Here's the passage which bears striking similarity to some of Otto's dialogue in the scene. Every visible symbol of legitimacy belonged to Aegon. He sat the Iron Throne. He lived in the Red Keep. He wore the Conqueror's crown, wielded the Conqueror's sword, and had been anointed by a septon of the faith before the eyes of tens of thousands. Grand Maester Orwyle sat in his councils, and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard had placed the crown upon his princely head. And he was male, which in the eyes of many made him the rightful king, his half-sister, the usurper. Otto then says that he's sent terms to Stark, Baratheon, and Tully, houses that swore to Rhaenyra originally, houses that Damon wanted to make contact with immediately before Rhaenyra and Jace blocked or forestalled him. Again, we see another small rift in Damon and Rhaenyra's outlook on the situation. Much like there were conflicts within the individual members of the Green faction last episode, we're starting to be shown that the Black faction is not in perfect lockstep either. Rhaenyra reminds Otto of the oaths that were sworn to her when she was installed as heir, and he spits back that those oaths are stale. Viserys siring a son obviously changed all that, he asserts, and like Fire and Blood purports, he may have a point. Some houses truly were swayed by that, as we will remember some of the lords at the hunt for Aegon the Conqueror babe's second birthday.
Yeah, although that was it was a Hightower who said that. So I'll just point out, in Fire and Blood, after hearing the terms, such as they are, Rhaenyra tears off Orwell's chain and presents it to her own maester, Gerardus. Here she rips off Otto's hand of the kingpin and calls him a traitor. You know, this guy has known her for most of her life. He served her father and King Jaehaerys, and now is revealed to have been plotting his own family's advancement for all these years, which Rhaenyra always suspected, and Damon as well. Both of them at different times warned Viserys that this is what was going on, but Otto was allowed to continue his hand, even reinstated after Lord Lionel Strong's death. Otto presents Rhaenyra here with a message from Alicent. It's the page from that book about Nymeria from episode 1, which is a reminder of their former friendship. And it gives Rhaenyra pause, as do his words. So we can imagine that after the events at Storm's End, it is going to appear to both Damon and Rhaenyra that the Greens have not once but twice offered friendship on one hand and treachery on the other. So they recently appeared to do that following the family dinner the night before Viserys' death and then the usurpation the next day. So this is not going to go over well, obviously, in the long run. The tragedy of Luke's death aside, I think that this appearance of deceit and double dealing is going to contribute a lot to the irreversible path the Blacks and Greens will soon find themselves upon. In the moment here, Damon wants to just execute Otto immediately for treason, as he so recently did with Sir Vaemond, but Rhaenyra stays his hand and tells Otto that King's Landing will have her answer on the morrow.
And then after this, we come back to the war room, and Damon is giving a speech about dragons, saying it is no easy thing to be a dragon slayer. This is a line right out of Fire and Blood, so I'm going to read the quote. In the Stepstones, my enemies learned to run and hide when they saw Caraxes' wings or heard his roar, but they had no dragons of their own. It's no easy thing for a man to be a dragon slayer, but dragons can kill dragons and have. Any maester who has ever studied the history of Valyria can tell you that. I will not throw our dragons against the usurpers unless I have no other choice. There are other ways to use them, better ways. So other than the order of council and coronation, the main difference between book and show here is, as Lady Gwyn mentioned earlier, that Damon urges caution in the books and is encouraging more aggression in the show. Here Rhaenyra says that in Dragon Wars in Old Valyria, everything got burned, and she doesn't want to rule over a kingdom of ash and bone. And at this stage, she is considering the terms offered by the Greens, which is infuriating Damon. She wonders aloud if, as queen, it's her duty to bring peace to the realm or to claim the Iron Throne at any cost. Remember that at the beginning of the episode, she was giving Lucerys a talk about doing duty. So Rhaenyra being stuck on Dragonstone with an army too small to attack King's Landing gave me major post-Blackwater Stannis vibes through this episode. And this part reminded me of when Stannis decided to serve the realm by going to the north rather than focusing on fighting for the throne. And of course, she did also sound a lot like her father there, a fact not lost on Damon. There must have been times in Damon's life where he was extremely frustrated with his brother, given that Damon was more assertive and Viserys was more cautious. And it was an Oberyn and Doran situation somewhat. Now he's seeing his wife displaying similar caution at a point where his fuses are blowing. He's just so angry, and it's bringing the worst out in Damon. He says that the enemy has already declared war, and he raises his voice aggressively. What are you going to do about it? Given Rhaenyra is still finding her feet as queen, he's doing her no favors in challenging her in front of a room that's full of men. Rhaenyra knows they should not be in conflict in front of their lords. It reflects poorly on both of them. And so when she orders the room cleared, we see Rhaenys as the last to leave, and she leaves with a grin on her face. I think that in this episode, Rhaenys becomes proud of Rhaenyra. She sees some of her younger self in her. She's very glad to see a woman come into power, and perhaps thinks that Rhaenyra is the sort of leader that, she could have been. It seems a long time ago now that Rhaenys told young Rhaenyra that men would rather put the kingdom to the torch than let a woman sit the Iron Throne. Here we are around 20 years later in the show, and Rhaenys wants to help her to that throne. I think that much is clear.
Yeah, absolutely. Rhaenys leaves, and now with no one else in the room, any restraint that Damon and Rhaenyra were showing falls away completely. All of the stress and the conflict that's been boiling under the surface in this episode, Rhaenyra birthing alone, them grieving Visenya separately, Damon's hawkish attitudes towards war during and after the labor, their different approaches to dealing with Otto Hightower, everything, it all comes to a head now. Damon claims that it is her duty to crush rebellion, and she says her oath reaches beyond personal ambitions to the Song of Ice and Fire. Damon shows no recognition to this, and Rhaenyra is somewhat stunned. At that moment, her doubts about her father's decision to, if she really was heir, making her heir, are struck down. She's finally affirmed completely in that choice. But simultaneously, Damon is dealt this crushing blow. Even from the beyond the grave, Viserys didn't, trust him with this secret that was meant only for kings and heirs. Rhaenyra wasn't confirmed as heir for a long time, and presumably that was either Damon or it was at least open to interpretation. So, feeling this had to be a knife to the heart for him. And he reacts accordingly. Not that I'm condoning it at all, but he grabs Rhaenyra by the throat, saying these omens and portents made Viserys a slave, and that dreams didn't make us kings, dragons did. It's a big shift in their dynamic. And again, Emma Darcy spoke about creating this scene and how intensely they and Matt Smith prepared for it. They affirm that both characters are definitely grieving, Damon obviously doing so in a very unhealthy and abusive manner. They also clarify that they think this is the first time that Damon has been violent with Rhaenyra, understanding that this is a huge pivotal moment and a huge change to their dynamic. While the couple has had a lot of conflict in the past few years, this was something new for them. Not a new moment for Damon specifically, though, who of course killed his first wife, Rhea Royce, earlier in the series. Whether this characterization of him as, an abusive partner is entirely book accurate or simply meant to illustrate Damon's grayness in a new way, the showrunners were definitely trying to show us that Damon is not some heroic figure where any action he takes is automatically noble or just. Ryan Condal said that Damon is an anti-hero and that we should prepare for some complexity, some terrible and irredeemable behaviors, and should not love him just because he looks cool riding a dragon. This scene will definitely make me think twice about cheering him on. You're muted.
When Damon asked Rhaenyra at the beginning of the scene, "Are you not angry?" I couldn't help but think of all the ways we've seen him deal with grief. In a way, as Emma Darcy noted in that recent interview you were just referencing, this episode is all about Rhaenyra's grief. But I do think it's important to remember that Damon is suffering nearly every loss that she is. So we're focused on her, but he's also suffering these same losses. And he has done so from the beginning. If we go all the way back to his comments about the heir for a day in the wake of Balon's and Emma's deaths, a lot of people felt that was possibly just him expressing his grief for his brother as only Damon could. Just, in other words, not very well. When Lena and their unborn child died, we saw another side of him grieving. And in this episode, when he heard the news of his brother's death, we saw that it just filled him with rage. And we later saw him struggle to share his grief over his daughter's death with his wife. Damon, as mercurial as he appears to be, isn't very good at having healthy emotions. And he often seems to be allowing himself to be driven by emotion rather than keeping them in check and directing them, which is something that Rhaenyra has actually been pretty good at so far.
Okay, I appreciate both of your comments on, it's a difficult scene for many people, so I want to acknowledge that. And I want to move on to talking about the scene with Corlys and Rhaenys. Yeah, in this next scene, we see Corlys wake up in front of a fire. He's sweating, his fever's broke. In episode 8, we learned he was in Tarth trying to recover from having his throat sliced and a subsequent sickness while fighting in the Stepstones. Given all the large time jumps this season, it's almost jarring that the last 3 have occurred over a few days. It seems so long ago, doesn't it, when Vaemond was killed? It's just a few days ago. Isn't that strange? After jumping like 10 years each episode anyway. It seems that Rhaenys must have sent word to his carers to bring Corlys to Dragonstone, and now she watches over him as he tries to regain his strength. Corlys comes to, and he immediately makes a joke which shows us that he's in good spirits. He's saying he's had men killed for falling asleep on their watch, but his wife is in no mood to laugh along. She feels abandoned by her husband, who in the wake of Laenor's death sought glory in the war against the Triarchy and left her side. You abandoned us for more adventures at the sea, she says. Corlys has been on many adventures, and given that Rhaenys, Baela, and Rhaena really needed him, Rhaenys has had quite enough, and I think she wants to take charge now. Corlys has heard news of the new king, but he hasn't yet heard about his brother Vaemond's death. As I said, it's just a few days ago, so he has a lot to process. Corlys reacts by saying ambition has always been the Valerian weakness, and that his wife was right about this, and that he's done fighting. He's just exhausted by now. He talks about reaching too far, which sounds a bit like the John Connington line from the main series. And Corlys wants to remain neutral in the upcoming civil war. But Rhaenys reminds him that this conflict is about more than ambition. She recognizes that. After all of Corlys's warring, it's Rhaenys that's now pushing him to get involved in the conflict and use his fully blooded and formidable fleet in the war. She says that Jace, Luke, and Joff are all in danger now that Aegon's king. She might be right about that. Corlys still believes Rhaenyra was complicit in Laenor's death, but now Rhaenys doubts that story, and I'm sure that they would have talked more about that, off screen, and that she set his mind to rest there. And she tells Corlys that Rhaenyra is now holding the realm together at present, and that really she's the only cool head in this male-dominated war room. And like I said earlier, I feel in this episode, Rhaenys grew proud of Rhaenyra.
Absolutely. There's a really nice transition from Rhaenys' words about Rhaenyra to Rhaenyra at the painted table, dealing with the bickering from her lords as she presumably wonders if they can really even still have peace. The Lord of the Tides and Princess Rhaenys are announced by Sir Eric, and the bickering stops. The Valerians enter, with the adults being greeted by Rhaenyra as Baela and Rhaena take their customary spots besides their betrothed. Corlys immediately clocks Damon's absence from the war room and, gets down to business. He tracks that the situation for Team Black as it stands is pretty bleak, tenuous and uncertain allies, many potential traitors. Rhaenyra reminds the Sea Snake that, these traitors or tenuous allies, technically include him. He swore oaths to her, but has not, reaffirmed them yet. And the situation feels tense for just a moment as the entire room waits to see what Lord Corlys will do. And Fire and Blood offers kind of some reasoning for this, talking about Rhaenyra's council. A dozen lesser lords, bannermen, and vassals to Dragonstone sat the Black Council as well. Celtigar of Claw Isle, Staunton of Rook's Rest, Massey of Stone Dance, Bar Emmon of Sharp Point, and Darklyn of Duskendale amongst them. But the greatest lord to pledge his strength to the princess was Corlys Velaryon of Driftmark. Though the sea snake had grown old, he liked to say that he was clinging to life like a drowned sailor clinging to the wreckage of a sunken ship. Mayhaps the seven have preserved me for this one last fight. Now, obviously, some of those words are a little different than what he shared privately with Rhaenys in the past, but we see that kind of shift in this scene. And without the power of House Velaryon and up against all the advantages that the Greens possess, Rhaenyra really would have no chance. Now granted the support of House Velaryon, they gain massive advantages. One, we've got powerful and wealthy House Velaryon to begin with. Since the Master of Coin, Tywin Lannister, sided with the Greens, they have the crown's gold. The Blacks need funding from somewhere, and Corlys is their wealthiest backer. They also have the Sea Snake's fleet. Corlys tells, that's number 2. Corlys tells Rhaenyra that this time they have fortified the Stepstones and currently control the Narrow Sea, learning from some missteps when they left it undefended last time. With many of Rhaenyra's allies holding key positions around Blackwater Bay, and with Driftmark and Dragonstone, both islands where the bay kind of meets the Narrow Sea, they're well positioned to take King's Landing by sealing the bay off and laying siege to it without Aegon's allies arriving in time to support. But they need more than just naval power for this, which brings me to number 3, dragons. Though Damon already counted Meleys and Baela's Moondancer as dragons for their side, their support was not guaranteed until this moment. Moondancer is a small dragon at this point, and Rhaena has not hatched an egg yet, so really it's just Rhaenys and Meleys that matter here. Rhaenys volunteers to patrol the gullet in support for their plan, able to defend allies and scout for enemy movement from the skies. Rhaenyra agrees to their plan, but still does not want to act without ensuring. She doesn't want to act in a way that ensures outright war before she knows who her allies actually are. The final piece of the plan involves messages to the great houses that Otto Hightower mentioned earlier: Stark, Arryn, and Baratheon. The Maester wants to send ravens to these high lords, but Jace pipes up with a line ripped nearly from the pages of Fire and Blood: "We should bear those messages. Dragons will win the lords over quicker than ravens."
Yes, and so apparently it is agreed that Jace and Luke will be the ones to bear the messages to House Stark, House Arryn, and House Baratheon. And then we get a brief scene where Rhaenyra describes their missions to Jace and Luke. She speaks about that old chestnut, Targaryens are closer to gods than men. Oh, it's clear she doesn't really believe it. She makes a joke about how the Iron Throne makes them closer, she guesses. Instead, she speaks again of service, duty, and which is really her understanding of what being a monarch is. And she mentions that they have to respect the gods of the 7 kingdoms if they will serve the 7 kingdoms, which is another clear reference to the fact that in this era, at least, Targaryens have still retained their own Valyrian religion. But she does demand that her boys swear on the 7-pointed star that they will take no part in any fighting, stressing that they go as emissaries, not knights. They swear. Luke obviously takes it most seriously, and then she gives them their messages. She's very reassuring to Luke, telling him that he has just a short flight, that he has Baratheon blood via his grandmother Rhaenys, and that Lord Boros will be honored to host a prince of the realm and his dragon. And as much as that extremely prescient line delivered to Luke's anxious little face struck at my heart, I also couldn't help but think of Ned Stark and his paper shield in the Game of Thrones. What Rhaenyra is really relying on is her message and on Boros's perception of kinship with her son to protect him, but What happens when Boros places no stock in either? What if Boros, like so many others in the realm, believes the gossip about her sons being strong? Surely sending one of them to emphasize a shared Baratheon kingship, in that case, is a huge mistake. Nonetheless, urging her sons to go to it, Rhaenyra sends them off with a smile, never guessing that she's never going to see her second child again. And as sad as that is, the scene concludes with this stunning shot of the dragons flying. You get Vermax and Jace, followed by Meleys and Rhaenys, escorting her grandsons on their way as she patrols the gullet. Then Arrax and Luke bringing up the rear. And the three of them fly in tandem for just a moment. And then Lucerys and his white and gold dragon head off south in the direction of Storm's End.
Okay, and speaking of stunning dragons, we next get an isolated scene where Damon ventures into the dragon's lair. He's singing in High Valyrian, and he does pretty good. Writing consultant T. Mickle has shared the lyrics that she wrote for this scene that were translated into High Valyrian by David J. Peterson. So it goes, "Fire breather, winged leather, but two heads to a third sing. From my voice the fires have spoken, and the price has been paid with blood magic. With words of flame, with clear eyes, to bind the three to you I sing. As one we gather, and with three heads we shall fly as we were designed, beautifully, freely." So, some nice Valyrian poetry there. It was a real surprise to get that. And I'm very, very glad that they included it. It sort of makes the world building, gives some more depth to the world building. And I've got to say, I'm intrigued by the line that says the price has been paid with blood magic. I'd love to know more. Anyway, Damon puts his torch down and a dragon emerges from the darkness and absolutely roasts the ceiling of the cave with a jet of flame. Damon remains calm, carries on singing. This is a castle dragon. Castle dragons are dragons that have already had a rider at some point, as opposed to the wild ones living around the volcanic areas. And it's noted in Fire and Blood and elsewhere that castle dragons are easier to tame than wild ones. And even though this dragon is spraying fire all over the place, I bet that he is calmer than the wild ones. And of course, this dragon is Vermithor, a male dragon who once belonged to King Jaehaerys. He's the king we saw at the start of the very first episode. Since Jaehaerys' death, Vermithor has remained riderless, but Damon knows how valuable this dragon is. Vermithor is around 100 years old, so although he's 80 years shy of Vhagar, he's had plenty of time to grow large. Dragons just grow on and on. They never stop growing. What Damon's thinking here, I believe, is that he needs dragons that are large enough to take down Vhagar. As we're about to see in the Vhagar versus Arrax scene, the younger dragons are not going to stand a chance. Vhagar is a super weapon among super weapons. The question for Damon is, who is going to ride the old king's dragon? Because once someone bonds with this dragon, the rider and the dragon seem to be linked for life. So this is going to be a huge call going forward. The short scene ends with Damon and Vermithor looking into each other's eyes, and we sense that Damon has big plans for this dragon. So it's very exciting to think about the future. Maybe we can mention this when we do our spoiler section. And unfortunately, the next scene proves the truth of Damon's dragon concerns.
Yes, it does. We're talking about Storm's End now. Luke arrives at Storm's End, and we immediately can see why it gets its name. Huge storm going. He announces himself, and before going inside, we get to see the great dragon Vhagar, ridden by Luke's uncle Aemond, too big for the castle yard. It's a bad omen, but the boy continues, taking his responsibility as messenger very seriously. He's announced to Lord Boros Baratheon, who is the current Lord of Storm's End. While his father, Lord Borman, ruled, the Baratheons were close with houses Targaryen and Valerian. Princess Rhaenys' mother was a Baratheon, making Rhaenys and Borman cousins. In Fire and Blood, it said that Borman was stone, but his son Boros, the current lord, was the wind that rages and howls, blowing this way and that. He's also a very proud man. It's unlikely that Rhaenyra's poor treatment of her suitors on Storm's End or the subsequent death of Gerald Bracken there left a super favorable impression on Boros either. So when Luke arrives with his mother's reminder, a step behind Aemond, he's already off balance. The Lord of Storm's End appears to be enjoying being courted by both sides of the House of the Dragon, mocking both Luke and Aemond at times. Luke's written message soon exposes Lord Boros as illiterate, and the message itself is poorly received. Boros proves to be a toxic combo of both proud and uneducated, and much prefers the flattery and a marriage pact between Prince Aemon and his daughter Floris to stern reminders and familial guilt from Rhaenyra via written messages, no less. The scene is really ripped right from the pages of Fire and Blood with only one major omission, which I'll come back to. But I really credit the writers and actors for bringing the motives behind the actions. Lord Boros tells Luke he isn't some pup to be whistled up at need to set against her foes, again using dialogue right from the book. He attempts to send Luke on his way at this point. Aemond, who's already won over Lord Boros, cannot help himself, though. He tells Luke he requires an eye in payment, calling him Lord Strong and accusing him of attempting to steal the throne from his brother, just generally taunting him and not letting things drop. Luke reminds him that he's there as a messenger, not a warrior, and after a brief conflict mostly brought on by Aemond, he's allowed to leave. Aemond appears triumphant, in this situation. That small book omission I mentioned is a prompting from Lord Boros' daughter, Maris, not the one that he chose, who asks Aemond if they cut off one of his balls along with one of his eyes to let Luke walk off like that. I was a little bit bummed that the Baratheon girls, dubbed the Four Storms in the books, didn't get any speaking parts, but omitting that taunt did add a bit of suspense for what comes next, particularly for non-book readers, I thought.
Okay, so with that set up, then it was on to, at the top of the episode, I was talking about, this wonderful sequence. I think that it sort of took our breaths away. So let's talk about that. When Luke leaves Storm's End, we see how bad the conditions are outside the castle. Arrax is a small young dragon who seems upset by the storm. Luke tells him to be calm, but already there are question marks about controlling an animal like this that's distressed. Arrax takes off and labors through the air. The wind is so strong that the dragon is being swept this way and that, really at the mercy of the elements. And the shots above the sea are really fantastic. There's thunder and lightning and pounding rain, major horror vibes. So major props to the effects department for their work on this sequence. We get a shot from under Arrax looking up with the clouds in the background and watching Arrax toil in the air. And then there's a bolt of lightning that lights up the sky, and we see Vhagar's silhouette gliding above them. This was amazing, brilliantly done. My heart nearly stopped in its chest. And it really reminded me of movies like Jaws, when you get a quick flash of the shark, and that's all it takes just to terrify you, just one quick second. And the shot also put into perspective exactly how much Vhagar is, alongside Arrax. We really got to see the difference between these two dragons. In the main series, Arstan Whitebeard tells Dany that dragons never stop growing. He of Vhagar is about 180 years old, and Arrax is around 12. So this is a total mismatch. And Arrax looks more like a bat than a dragon in some of these scenes. Luke sees Vhagar, and you know that he's vulnerable. He feels vulnerable. So Vhagar wheels around and almost collides with Arrax, and we hear Aemon's cartoon villain laughter, a twirling mustache movie cliche that I know not everyone enjoyed, including Lady Gwyn, who moaned to me about it. But it certainly conveyed how comfortable Aemon and Vhagar were in that storm. It wasn't bothering them. Arrax dives and turns with Vhagar snapping at the heels, and the smaller dragon manages to find safety in the crevice between two rocks. If I was Luke, I would have stayed there out of harm's way, because Vhagar is so large he can't get close. Instead, Arrax darts past Vhagar, and as Luke tries to control him, Arrax can't help himself and spits out flame at Vhagar. This is just, this is not what you want to be doing. Luke is screaming at his dragon to serve him, and at the same time, we see Aemon struggling to control his dragon, the mightily pissed off Vhagar, who did not appreciate getting that bolt of flame in her face. So Arrax climbs in the sky, and we get an absolutely stunning shot above the storm clouds. It's a moment of calm for Jace, who looks relieved. The viewer is disarmed for a moment in this beautiful environment, and then from out of nowhere comes Vhagar to take both dragon and rider between her jaws, apparently acting against Aemon's orders there. And so, yeah, there's this discussion about how much control a rider has over their dragon. But remember that Septon Barth wrote, it may well be that dragons somehow sense and echo the moods of their riders. So there's this sort of telepathic intuition going on. And yeah, if you think, well, Aemon was chasing Arrax very closely, so what sort of message did that give to Vhagar? And yeah, in the text, even when the blacks and the greens were at peace, their dragons could sense the hidden hostilities. Peace prevailed through the realm, though there were some sharp-eyed who observed the dragons of one party snapping and spitting flames at the dragons of the other party whenever they passed near each other. So yeah, like I was saying, are you really going to blame Vhagar for this? I'm not sure. I think that Aemon might have tried to pull out of it at the last moment, but he was there and he was aggressively pursuing Arrax, and that was a very dangerous thing to be doing, and he was doing that on purpose. So, if you're going to blame Vhagar, you've got to consider that she was picking up on the mood of the rider. She was distressed by the storm, and she was definitely triggered by Arrax's attack. These are animals, after all. You can bond with these animals, but they're still animals. And as such, they have a mind of their own. And, I don't see that as any sort of weak writing to portray the dragons in that way.
Yes. This is fascinating because the scene introduces a concept of dragon free will, which is something I'd wager most of us never really gave much thought to before Sunday. Viserys remarked earlier in the season that the idea we control the dragons is an illusion, which was pretty easy to write off in the moment when he said it, considering he had never ridden a dragon since Valerian's death, and even that was just one quick spin about the castle, as it's described. So I think many of us had considered that the bond between dragon and rider is absolute and kind of like a warg thing, right? That an experienced rider and dragon would always act in consort. But remember, these two riders aren't really all that experienced. Even Aemon is pretty fresh, especially when you take his mount, the nearly 200-year-old Vhagar, into account. Recall that Balerion, the Black Dread, was noted to be very hard to control later in his life. His flight to Valyria with Arya Targaryen being extreme evidence of that. And if you don't know what I mean about that reference, you can read about it in Fire and Blood, or check out our new episode all about dragons, where we talk through that pretty dramatic event. We know that Dany's dragons don't always listen to her, especially Drogon during her final chapter in the Dothraki Sea. And we also see the training that the young princes are, undergoing in House of the Dragon. They're learning High Valyrian. They're learning techniques for controlling the dragons from these specially trained dragon keepers. And that certainly, I think, underscores that control isn't as easy as just forming a bond. It's not something that just happens naturally. So given Aemon's aggression towards Luke, I did find this scene to be a curious departure at first, but I think it actually works pretty well with not only with the idea that a dragon is no slave, which is a line I was reminded strongly of when Aemon was commanding Vhagar to serve him, but also with the repeated suggestion that bonded dragons are highly attuned to the emotions of their riders. As Yolkboy was saying earlier, both of these riders were highly agitated. Luke was scared and his dragon tried to protect him. Aemond was full of rage and the joy of the chase, and Vhagar just gave in to that. Whatever was going through Aemon's mind in those last moments, I'd say he has some work ahead of him when he returns to King's Landing. He's going to have to take responsibility for this, and we all know that this is kind of the point of no return in the conflict between the Blacks and the Greens. And whether Aemond does so in a way that continues to humanize him, or if he goes further down the road of cartoon villain, I guess remains to be seen. So probably be a while before we get to answer that question fully. So this does bring us to the final scene of the episode, which has no dialogue. It is pure physical acting, as so many of the really great scenes of this season have been, especially ones that involve Matt Smith as Damon. He's so fantastic at this physical, silent acting. We see Damon enter the council chamber where Rhaenyra is standing at the painted table with her counselors. He approaches her and sort of gently takes her hand and draws her away from the group. And we see only their backs as he speaks to her. But regardless, you can pinpoint the exact moment when he says the words, "Your son is dead." She staggers, but she pulls herself together and turns around, and it's very clear that all of her efforts to avoid war have now failed. She has suffered a wound from which there can be no recovery and no reconciliation ever, only fire, blood, vengeance. And speaking of fire and blood, Damon isn't actually present for this scene in the book. He's already in the Riverlands, but he's obviously received the news in parallel with Rhaenyra. So I thought we would end this analysis with the passage from the book, which says, "On Dragonstone, Queen Rhaenyra collapsed when told of Luke's death. Luke's young brother Joffrey, Jace was still away on his mission north, swore a terrible oath of vengeance against Prince Aemond and Lord Boros. Only the intervention of the Sea Snake and Princess Rhaenys kept the boy from mounting his own dragon at once. As the Black Council sat to consider how to strike back, a raven arrived from Damon. An eye for an eye, a son for a son," Prince Damon wrote. "Lucerys shall be avenged." ...
Okay, so that's our left to right analysis done, but stay with us because we've still got more. We're going to do some fun featurettes now, and then we're going to have a spoiler section towards the end. So stick around. So why don't we lighten the mood and do our fun sections? Let's start Dragon Watch. How was Dragon Watch today, Lady Gwyn?
Oh, this week on Dragon Watch, we had 7 dragons. Yoke boy, 7. Guys, Meleys, Vermax, Arrax, Caraxes, Syrax, Vermithor, and Vhagar. Plus, we had Damon's list where he enumerated all the dragons, almost all. He talks about the Blacks' numerical advantage over the Greens and dragons. 13 for the Blacks, who are Syrax, Caraxes, Meleys, Vermex, Arrax, Taraxes, which is young Joffrey Valerian's dragon. Moondancer, Sea Smoke, Vermithor, and Silverwing, plus the 3 wild dragons, whose names he does not mention. versus the Greens 4. He very distinctly says the Greens have 4 dragons, but he only mentions 3 adults, Vhagar, Sunfire, and Dreamfire. In my opinion, that unmentioned 4th dragon probably belongs to the unmentioned 4th child of Alicent and Viserys, Daeron, which is Alicent's younger son. Not seen in this season. We've talked about it in the streams before, so I think, and George has publicly said that he's going to be in season 2. So hopefully that's not too much of a spoiler, that there is actually a 4th son, and he's got a dragon. Not 4th son, 4th child. But yeah, so big dragon watch, probably the biggest one yet.
Yeah, I think overall this season, the dragons have been good. I think earlier in the season, there was a couple of scenes I was like, this CGI isn't quite there. And then they really pulled out all the stops for the really important scenes, which I'm fine with. You know, if they can't get everything correct, you know, focus it on the breathtaking chase scenes. And I had no complaints about the Vhagar sequence. What did you think, Emily?
Yeah, I think, you know, you showed the shot earlier of Vhagar with Arrax under him and that comparison, and I instantly thought of the scene from episode 7, I believe, when Vhagar gets claimed, and it's small Vhagar with the moon in the background. And I love the way that they kind of threaded those two themes together to kind of illustrate scale. Vhagar didn't look very big the first time against the moon, but then compared to little Arrax there. Ooh.
Yeah, Vhagar is colossal. Like I said, the ultimate super weapon in this show.
And by the way, Arrax is, you know, small, but when you see Luke fly into the yard at Storm's End and dismount, Arrax is not tiny. He's he's pretty good size. Certainly was big enough to make the long journey. So the comparison there is pretty astonishing. Similar
to Drogon in probably like season 4 or 5 size, before Drogon just got out of control huge in Game of Thrones. So yeah, I mean, very capable of that was after the Dracarys moment in Astapor. So he definitely capable of fucking shit up, so to speak.
Okay, so now let's move on, and our fun section, Champ or Chump. So let's talk about the Champ of the week, and I give that to Emily. Who's the champ this week?
Once again, I'm going to say I think you guys might have designed it so that I had to pick the Chump during the green episode and then the Champ during the black episode, and that was hard work. I've gone back and forth on this all week, but I think as of time of recording, I have settled on Sir Eric Cargill. While Rhaenyra was obviously a champ and much more queenly than her Fire and Blood depiction during this sequence, and Rhaenys was incredibly influential in bringing aid to the Blacks, Sir Eric won out for me. He has less personal investments in the Blacks by quite a bit, and in fact had to turn his back on his brother in order to choose who he saw as the true heir, someone that he felt was honorable enough to rule the 7 kingdoms. His arrival with the crown gives Rhaenyra kind of one of her first major symbols of legitimacy, as did the vows he swore in front of that group of people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay. Wow. I like that. So, Chump of the week, Lady Gwyn. Who's the chump?
It's not Chomp, as I see in the chat. It's Chump. if it was Chomp of the week, yes, it would definitely be Vhagar. But no, Chump definitely for me. Boros Baratheon. This guy is a chump. I get he might have been any of the things that Fire and Blood suggests at the moment when Lucerys arrived in his hall, ashamed at being caught entertaining the Green Prince. Maybe he was excited at having 2 claimants vying for his support. Maybe he was drunk. Typical Baratheon. I don't know. Maybe he was afraid. Let's face it. Vhagar was literally sitting outside his walls, and Aemond doesn't exactly exude warmth, so maybe he was peeing his pants. But the least he could have done is receive Luke in private, or maybe think about having his maester read Rhaenyra's entire letter instead of the 5-second cliff notes. Maybe he could have demanded that Aemond stay in the castle after Luke left. It's easy enough to say, if you want my support, just let the boy leave, or maybe remind the angry prince about the perils of kinslaying or something, rather than just guest right. Nope, he just tosses them out from under his roof like a bouncer in a bar, telling him, take it outside in the name of avoiding personal liability. And who cares what happens next? I think that Boris Baratheon ought to have the word chump tattooed on his forehead.
Okay, so why don't we finish the episode by talking about a topic each that we wanted to discuss, but we couldn't because we want to be spoiler free and not ruin everyone's perception of the future of the story who hasn't read Fire and Blood. So let's give a huge heads up for spoiler time. Lady Gwyn?
Spoilers all books.
Yeah, spoilers all books. Lady Gwyn, what spoilery topic are you going to talk us through?
Well, I think that this episode did a great job introducing or highlighting a number of characters who are going to be significant in future seasons. I was just talking about one of them, Boros Baratheon. He's not going to be all that significant, to be honest. He basically sits out the war after this event, probably because he's terrified of facing dragons in the field, especially black dragons. But yep, we will see more of him. We've got Maester Gerardus, Rhaenyra's maester, who will be named her Grand Maester and will eventually suffer an ugly end at the hands of her half-brother. We've got Lord Bartimos Celtigar, who was introduced here, is Rhaenyra's Master of Coin, will almost single-handedly ruin her brief reign and reputation in King's Landing. We saw Lady Alinda Massey, one of Rhaenyra's ladies-in-waiting, who will loyally remain with her until the bitter end, and I mean the bitter end. In Fire and Blood, she witnesses Rhaenyra's grisly fate and reportedly gouges her eyes out in grief and horror. We've got Sir Steffan Darklyn, who will be named Lord Commander of the Queensguard, but will die during the sowing of the seeds, trying to mount Laenor Valerian Seasmoke. Sir Laurent Marbrand, who follows Darklyn as Lord Commander, will eventually perish in the riots of King's Landing, along with several of his fellows, and Sir Eric Cargill, whose death was hinted at in this episode when Damon mentioned the Green's potential for a stealth attack, which, as we know, and we've discussed before, will come in the form of Eric's twin, Sir Eric, who was also in this episode accompanying Sir Otto on his mission to Dragonstone. So there you go. There are no happy endings, folks. Sorry. But I think that this episode did a great job establishing characters who have been either not seen before or have been mostly in the background and are going to have larger roles in upcoming season or seasons. And seeing all of those names pop up on my screen definitely made me really look forward to future episodes.
Absolutely. You covered some maybe more minor or secondary characters really well. I like to cover characters in this section too, and I realized I'd covered pretty much every member of House Velaryon at this point. So it's time to talk about the matriarch by marriage, Rhaenys, the queen who never was. We've talked a ton about her history, so I'll try to just hit on the critical points here. We did an excellent breakdown of her backstory and history in the preview episode in season 1. I think Gwyn did that section for us. So I'll focus on her from kind of the start of the dance onward. Unlike in the show, Rhaenys was not in King's Landing at the time of Aegon's crowning, and her husband had already recovered from the illness that led to the succession crisis and Vaemon's death. Furthermore, House Velaryon's ties to Rhaenyra through the marriage pacts with Jace and Baela, Luke and Rhaena were sealed long ago. So Rhaenys and House Velaryon were pretty much all in on Team Black from the get-go. I did appreciate the show giving Rhaenys more agency and time to arrive at that decision. Her feelings about Rhaenyra being named heir by the very man, her cousin, who supplanted her claim were no doubt complex. So it's nice to see the show exploring that and then allowing her to definitively choose Rhaenyra. Rhaenys came to the Black Council with wisdom and a desire to gain the advantage over the with dragons. Damon's speech, like mentioned earlier, about the wild and unclaimed dragons actually comes from Rhaenys in Fire and Blood. In the Black Council, she agrees to be her husband's eye in the sky and help seal the gullet while the children act only as messengers. Damon wasn't at the council in the show, but he is going to be heading off to Harrenhal in the Riverlands. And Rhaenyra actually remains at Dragonstone for a while to recover strength from her birth. Again, that might be changed considering she was mounting a dragon like a day after birth in the show. But like Gwen said, no one has happy endings, and I fear that we won't have much screen time left with our queen that never was. Her mission will soon take her to Rook's Rest in an attempt to lay waste to Sir Criston Cole and his armies. What waits for her there? Well, I don't know how far I should spoil. Tune in next season.
Will do.
I don't want to say it because I don't want to make Gwen
No,
cry
fair
on
enough.
stream.
Say
don't
it,
need
you make
to.
it real.
Yeah, don't make it real. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
The writers like to change things, so.
We're barbecuing Cole and gonna have a party at Rook's Rest. It's fine.
Kristen and Otto get barbecued in the first minute of season 2, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Speaking of which,
Now that we've settled that,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to more dragon action next season. I think that we all love dragons after Game of Thrones, but the variety that's come into the fore has really captured people's imaginations, and the show's done well to give them unique characteristics and so forth. So I'm very happy this season and looking forward to more. As Damon mentioned, the Blacks do have more dragons that are currently riderless. We saw Vermithor and then the Silverwing and Sea Smoke, who have all previously had riders. But there's 3 wild dragons, Sheep Stealer, Grey Ghost, and the Cannibal. Given dragons are the key to winning the war, the Blacks will be looking to pair these dragons up with riders. But there's a big problem. They're going to have to look outside of their immediate family to do so. In Fire and Blood, the Blacks encourage dragon seeds to try and mount these 6 dragons in return for awards like lands and lordships and honor. And dragon seeds are the illegitimate children of Targaryens or their descendants and relatives that are living on Dragonstone who have a drop of Targaryen blood. Sure, pairing up the riders with dragons sounds like a great plan, doesn't it? But in reality, it's desperation. It's really a desperate move, and allowing characters they don't really know to mount these weapons of mass destruction puts a lot of faith in these seeds. What could possibly go wrong? Well, I can't wait to see how this is all portrayed and panning out in season 2. I think it's going to be great. More dragon action for one thing. And I'm really excited in particular, to see the 3 wild dragons. The mud brown, ugly looking, sheep munching sheep stealer. I don't think you're ugly, sheep stealer. Everyone's favorite pescatarian, Grey Ghost, always in for the diving into the sea for fish. And the one with a taste for his own, the Cannibal. Dragon lovers, we have a lot to look forward to in season 2 of House of the Dragon. Okay, so that brings an end to our show reviews. But as we said earlier, we will be having a season 1 wrap-up live stream. And, it's for a good cause. And that's going to be on YouTube only because it'll be more informal. There'll be more guests and it won't suit the podcast format. So if you're listening on the podcast, come and subscribe to Radio Westeros on YouTube and don't miss out on the fun. And I think it will be a lot of fun. And so I want to say thank you to our super chatters, Roxanne Silva, Revolution Outdoors and Stuff, Sanrixian. Thank you. Thanks to everyone that's given us a super chat throughout the season. We really appreciate that. And a big thank you to Egg6, our friend who has provided all of the screenshots that we've used. Thank you so much. Oh, and a new super chatter, Blue Insanity. Thank you. Wow, that's great. And I want to say thank you to our chat mods, because sometimes you do get troublemakers and it sort of really dorks up the chat environment, and our mods make sure that doesn't happen. So thanks to all of you. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank Emily for joining us, and your analysis has been really appreciated. It's not easy to join us and sort of fit in around us, because me and Lady Gwyn are in the same house. We've been working together since, 8-9 years. And for a third person to come in and do all this work is not easy. And Emily has just excelled every time. So thank you, Emily.
Thanks, guys. I've been having so much fun all season with you. Yeah. I don't have my own podcast or anything. I am on Twitter at Emily of the Eerie. I've been on a few of your live streams in the past, and I also occasionally join Sanrixian for her Patreon streams. So, follow me on Twitter and or join the Discord. I know you're promoting the Discord earlier. Oh, my dog's here to say hello. And hang out with me on the Discord. We have so much fun in the Radio Westeros Discord. Games. We've lots of hype about the books, great discussions about this series and others. So join us.
Yeah, we'll leave that Discord link in the description for like 24 hours or something. So come and join us. You're all welcome. It'd be great to see some of you join in and carry on the discussion in that environment. Okay, and finally, I want to say thanks to all our patrons who keep us going and keep our ship sailing. Thanks to all patrons. It's been a great season. Thanks to everyone that's tuned in, all of you who have come and made our live streams a lot more fun and interactive. Appreciate every single person that's tuned in. And yeah, I think it was a great season. I think everyone had a good time. So I think we made some good memories together, guys. Thank you. So why don't we lead out, Lady Gwyn, with our Patreon roll?
Okay. Bye, everybody. Radio Westeros is supported by patrons. Thanks to all of you, including our Valerian Steel patrons, Aileen, Akiva of House Hunt, Akka from Ashai, Oxheart, Amber the Adamant, Anna, Hortense of Ashai, Arshia, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabot the Unfrozen, Marge of the Mage, David, Dean, James K., Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Jill, Miss Jody, J.M., Herbert Westeros, the Miskatonic Maester, Epimetheus, June of House Aiko, Casey, Lady Silverwing, Infandaris, the Unspeakable Terror, Luke, Mark, Boss, Noble Sir Matthew, Sword of the Early Moon, the Sithorian, Sally, Sheila, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron. And our Castle Steel patrons, AJ, Aegon VI, The Only Arsling You Need, Alex, Ali B, Ali C, Amber, Astronaut Yara, Oakenfist, Bran the Builder, Brian, Camille, Casey, Charitable Rereadings, Chris, Christian, Maddie and Jessica, Sir Clint the Andal, Sir Duncan Cole, Convenience or Death, Sir Archibald Cadogan, David, Dimitri B, Dennis, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Eerie, Ezra, Felix, Sir Gage, Armorer of Castle Greyguard, Sir Gladworth, Greg, History of Westeros, Goldie Juke, Jim McGeehan, Winter's King, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Cenarion, the White Storm, Julie Beth of Tarth, Judson, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Katie, Lady Kelly, Mistress of the Old Bay of Crabs, Mathos of House Baratheon of Dragonstone, armed with the Valyrian sword Malice, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Nessie the Questing Beast, Monaro Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, and Matt M. as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Michael M., Anime Lover Nicole, Nimble Nick Wyrick, Patrick, Peter Pebble, PJ, Paul B., Paul H., Raymond, Richard, Sam, Sarah, Sean, Sir Daniel the Sneaky Russian, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sherry, Cern, Kaiser Susie of the Free Folk, Terry, Sir Terrence, Knight of the Cedars, Theo, the Cannibal of Casterly Rock, Hema Helmut, the Sellsword Sentinel, Val and Valentine, Maiden of the Black Frost, Virginie, Warren Halfhand, and Yvonne. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron and you could be hearing your name here too. Visit patreon.com/Radio Westeros for details. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Bye for now.